except for some natural situation, disasters like this is happening now with the sea parting.
And Susan, when you said the footnote, which
It's at time.
oh,
That's
you're in eighth time. Oh, great.
on page 403 with a footnote to 14, which
Nice.
the Lord will battle for you.
Great. I love the eighth time commentary. That's the one that I use most often as well.
Yeah, it's really good.
It's great. Okay, so we are going to continue with God's response to Moses. Then God said to Moses, "Why do you cry out to me? Tell the Israelites to go forward. And you lift up your rod and hold out your arm over the sea and split it, so the Israelites may march into the sea on dry ground. And I will stiffen the hearts of the Egyptians so that they go in after them, and I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his warriors, his chariots, and his riders. Let the Egyptians know that I am God when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his riders." Okay, so we have God's response. And one of the things that I think is interesting is that, especially in the last part, God repeats God's self about gaining glory and how that's happening. Knowing that I am God, we see these elements repeated in this one small speech, and then we see those same ideas repeated over and over again. And the piece here about telling the Israelites to go forward, I think is also something that, I think about a lot, this imagery of the Israelites feeling that sense of stuckness, with the fear and thinking about where they came from, not knowing where they're going, an army coming after them, not sure what's about to happen, and that God's response is go forward. I think on the one hand, to me feels like a little bit harsh, like go forward into the sea. You just want these people who have been slaves to keep walking. And on the other hand, when we are in those moments of fear, it feels so easy to just be stuck and not want to move. And like God giving that permission, like, no, go forward. There are good things coming. You can move forward. Yeah, Susan.
So this reminds me of a book I read a while ago called Providence and Power by Rabbi Meir Soloveitchik. He was, I think, the great nephew of the great Soloveitchik. But he used those two terms, providence and power, providence being a faith in God and God's help and providence, and giving human beings power. And he lists 10 portraits of Jewish heroes in past and up to relatively present, and what they accomplished with that.
That's awesome. That's really beautiful. Wait, I need to read that. Sorry, what did you say? It's called Providence and Power.
Providence and Power by Meir Soloveitchik, and he's a rabbi in a New York, I forgot which one,
Yeah.
a New York synagogue, and he speaks about Shlomit Zion, Esther, the two women, and then there's a number of Abravanel, a historical, and they're small chapters, but he does a great job, and it's a pleasant read too.
Okay, that's great to know. Thank you so much for that book suggestion. Um, okay, so we have God responding to Moses. So also, as we're painting this picture in our head, I also want us to envision the people crying out to Moses, and then Moses having a conversation with God. Brad.
Yeah, the word glory that appears twice in the text there. I mean, when I think of glory, I think of military, again, the military battle imagery. But are we supposed to interpret it here as renown, that my name will become known to others? Is that the sense of glory here?
So that's interesting.
Is God on a publicity campaign
right.
to make his name known?
I mean, I'm curious to hear what other people think. I think a little bit. The word glory also comes up a lot. And like, that's one of the words I also want to look at when we get to chapter 15 is how the rabbis interpret that word and how they understand how do we glorify God. I think the pshat, like the most surface reading here is by the Egyptians, the Israelites, Pharaoh, everybody knowing that God is the one true God. And then the rabbis sort of complicate that idea thousands of years later, saying, okay, well, what does that mean for how we live Jewishly today? What does that look like to glorify God in our Jewish practice? Benjamin.
Interesting point from Brad about God proving God's self. We go through the plagues, which are supposed to be, you don't believe me now, you don't believe me now, you don't believe me now.
Right.
Now this, I mean, does God have some kind of identity crisis? You sort of think any one of those plagues or such would be proof that I got some mojo.
Yeah, God, right, which is the whole reason the Israelites were able to make it here to begin with, was that the plagues worked so well. Pharaoh did recognize God's power, and that's how the Israelites made it to the sea and out of Egypt in the first place. And God, right, is it like that's interesting, like a little bit of God's ego, that God like really needs to be glorified by, like continue to be glorified both by the Israelites and also by the Egyptians. Okay, we are going to keep reading. The messenger of God, who had been going ahead of the Israelite army, now moved and followed behind them. Okay, so more picture painting in our heads. There is some kind of angel that is present with the Israelite army, has been ahead of them until this moment, and is now behind them. And the pillar of cloud shifted from in front of them and took up the place behind them. So this pillar of cloud is what goes with the Israelites as they wander through the wilderness for the next 40 years. And we see it here with them at the Red Sea as well. So painting the picture in our head, we're adding an angel to the mix, and we're adding a pillar of cloud that was in front of them and now is behind them, maybe as some kind of protection. We don't know exactly, but that's part of what's happening in the image in our head. Okay. And it came between the army of the Egyptians and the army of Israel. Back to what Brad was saying before, thinking about God as doing battle, now we are seeing the army of Egyptians, which makes sense. They've got horses, they've got chariots, they're the ones who have power and are in control. I think the army of Israel here is such interesting language to think about these people who they have been slaves, the generations past them that they knew have been slaves, and now they are being called an army. So the text seems to be setting us up. What do people make of that word, the army of Israel, being used here? Yeah, Benjamin,
Jump
go
in
ahead.
again. To me, it doesn't necessarily have to mean they're an armed camp of an army, because sometimes, you might say a swarm of people or an army of people are approaching the stadium. So it's not necessarily an armed
Yes.
force.
Yes. It's not right. It's not necessarily that they are armed. And we know that the people took things from the Egyptians. The Israelites took things from the Egyptians before they left. Maybe they took something that was able to be used as a weapon. Maybe they didn't. We don't see those instruments of battle or an instrument of an army, but the language of army is interesting, knowing that when it's used here for the Egyptians, it does mean the instruments of an army that I think it's safe to assume that they're armed because it talks about their chariots and horses and riders and things like that. Yeah, Nina, and then we're going to keep reading. Nina, you are muted.
All right. First of all, they were given things by the Egyptian. They didn't take. Pharaoh told them, take whatever we're giving you, blah, 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 just go, because the firstborns were dying. That's number one. Number two, don't you think that this is some kind of continuity, that we have peace with Egypt till today? And out of all the whole area, they are actually recognizing the benefits of living in peace with Israel today. So there was a connection there always, that they kind of like depended on each other and recognized the strength of actually working together. So actually, according to the story, they were given things. They didn't take them. They were told, take, and just go. So I think we should read the Hebrew more carefully before we are being declaring statements that are not exactly the way they are in the Bible story itself. That's all.
Yeah. Yeah, and the midrash is interesting, because then the midrash gets into, in the plague of darkness, when the Israelites had light, they were able to use that light and go into Egyptians' homes. And so it's interesting the way the rabbis play with that language as well. Brad, go ahead.
Yeah, thinking more about the battle and glory and the army. We're in the language of epic poetry here. This is the Iliad. The Trojans versus the Achaeans. This is it's the language. This is rising the story. It's not just a story, it's now become an epic.
Nice. And once we get to chapter 15, we really see that epic and that poetry. And then in the Haftorah, we see that also, because the Haftorah is the story of Deborah and the song that she sang after a battle. And so we see that very clear parallel here. Okay, we are going to keep reading chapter 14. Thus there was a cloud with darkness, and it cast a spell upon the night, so that the one could not come near the other all through the night. Then Moses held out his arm over the sea, and God drove back the sea with a strong east wind all night and turned the sea into dry ground. I just want to point out a few natural elements that are here that I think are interesting. One, the darkness of night. And then Moses being that person who holds out his arm. And then God is the one to actually perform the miracle, of course, but Moses seems integral to this moment. And that God drives it back. It doesn't say, God holds out God's arm and then the sea parts. It says Moses holds out his arm, and then the way God parts the sea is with a wind that God has enabled to blow. So it's actually a natural element that is coming in, that is splitting the sea through God's doing, but the wind is doing a lot of heavy lifting with this water. The waters were split, and the Israelites went into the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. The Egyptians came in pursuit after them into the sea, all of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and riders. At the morning watch, God looked down upon the Egyptian army from a pillar of fire and cloud and threw the Egyptian army into a panic. As we're painting that story, now we had this pillar of cloud, and now we also have a pillar of fire, which we see throughout the rest of the Torah with the Israelites in the wilderness. God locked the wheels of the chariot so that they moved forward with difficulty, and the Egyptians said, "Let us flee from the Israelites, for God is fighting for them against Egypt." Then God said to Moses, "Hold out your arm over the sea, that the waters may come back upon the Egyptians and upon their chariots and upon their riders." Moses held out his arm over the sea, and at daybreak the sea returned to its normal state, and the Egyptians fled at its approach. But God hurled the Egyptians into the sea. The waters turned back and covered the chariots and the riders, Pharaoh's entire army that followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained. But the Israelites had marched through the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. Thus God delivered Israel that day from the Egyptians. Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the shore of the sea. And when Israel saw the wondrous power which God had wielded against the Egyptians, the people feared God. They had faith in God and in God's servant Moses. Okay. Elements that stick out before we continue with chapter 15. One of the things that sticks out for me is at the end when it talks about Israel seeing the power of God and God's glory and having faith in God, that the text specifically tells us the power that God had wielded against the Egyptians, that for the Israelites, a big piece of their faith seems to be connected not just to now they are free, they were able to cross to safety, but also what God did to their enemy. What God did for them and what God did to their enemy seems to be a big focus of their redemption story. Okay, any other comments? One of the most miraculous parts of the Torah. Yeah, Nina, and then we'll go to chapter 15.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I want to just remind whoever is depending on explanations from the rabbis, with a lot of respect to those explanations, but those explanations also will, I think, I would say inspired or motivated by the conditions that the rabbis themselves lived in when they wrote it. So you cannot just, how do you call it, extract ideas from a person who isn't exposed to certain elements that are happening around their own lives in order to inspire the translation or the explanation. So when we are reading what this rabbi said, and this rabbi said, with all due respect, I do believe that they are knowledgeable and very clever and smart and knowledgeable people. I'm not disregarding this, but I always think that the conditions of where they themselves lived and in which country was expiring their explanations and their decisions to actually even say it.
Yeah, and so in a second, we're going to look at a couple commentaries from the rabbis and keep in mind, of course, it's based on their time and place and understanding of the text and also what they want and need from the text, just like all of us when we offer our own interpretation, it's coming from us personally. All right, so we just had the narrative of what happened, and now we are getting the poetry of what happened that is very closely connected to what Brad was saying before about these epics. Then Moses and the Israelites sang this song to God. They said, I will sing to God for, I'm just going to read the pronouns here, but I'm not implying that that God is gendered. I just want to say that. Okay. For he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and driver he has hurled into the sea. God is my strength and might. He has become my deliverance. This is my God, and I will enshrine or glorify, depending on what translation you use. And I will enshrine or glorify him. The God of my father's house, and I will exalt him. Okay. So this is the beginning of Az Yashir is what it is in Hebrew that is usually read during Shacharit, during the morning service, which placement itself is interesting that these are the words that we are intended to say each morning. So we have some of the language from chapter 14 that is used, like God triumphing gloriously, like those same images are there. The word glorious is there. Horse and driver being hurled into the sea. I think, Susan, I know you have the Eitz Chaim Chumash in front of you. One of the things I think that's interesting that the Eitz Chaim Chumash notes is that it talks about the horse and the driver here, and it didn't do that in chapter 14. It talked about the people who were killed on the Egyptian side, but here also talking about the horses seems to be just like an interesting poetic note that's happening as well. And then this piece about this is my God and I will enshrine or I will glorify him. Before we look at how the rabbis understand that, I'm curious to hear how you, if you were to think about what it means to enshrine or glorify God in your own Jewish life today, what would that look like, Susan?
What I wanted to say before that question is the Hebrew, and it's usually pronounced Adonai rather than God. And I think the rabbis make this distinction between Adonai as a personal God and coming on the scene generally with Moses. And God, the generic, or Elohim, is another one, another non-personal God. Now, I guess it could be used interchangeably here, but I see it more as Adonai, because that Adonai is protecting the Israelites. He's using Elohim, the power of nature, to do it. But I see it more as it should be as Adonai there.
Thank you. And one of the things I appreciate about this text is from Sefaria is that any time it says Adonai in the text, it's here in the Hebrew. And so you can differentiate, even in the translation, the different names of God. The
Right.
only reason I've been saying God, and maybe I should say Adonai in the English also, is traditionally saying the word Adonai is reserved for saying an entire verse of Torah in the original Hebrew. But since we're reading it in the English, we can certainly use that here as well. Just wanted to explain my own thinking behind the words that I was saying. Okay, Susan, thank you. So if we think about this is my God and I will enshrine, I will glorify him, how do you see yourself or us doing that in our own Jewish lives today? What does that mean for us? Yeah, Meryl.
I'm thinking just how we respect God and how we as individuals, and everybody's different, looks at God for what God can do for them.
Nice.
Or does do for them.
Nice. So like a personal God that way, which is related also to what Susan was talking about. Yeah, Benjamin.
I think of it in terms, and I think I learned this recently in terms of the word hineni, I am here. And when I'm here right now. And
What?
I try to, live that as much as I can. I mean, it's not always. But when I'm here, I'm here.
Nice. So like an aspirational hineni. Thank you. Yes.
And some realization, Rabbi.
And yeah. Yes. Susan and then Rebecca.
No, I see with the glorification, I see some of it as communal. I see it the most, feel it in services. Now that's the communal thing. We have the Torahs there. I don't have a Torah in my house. I mean, I have the book, of the Torah, but not hands-on parchment scroll. So I see it there, and we glorify God by glorifying the Torah too. We have a cover on it. We use the yod. We have bells and crowns and the like. And I think in terms of individuals, one can glorify. I mean, it's much more limited in terms of the word glorify, but one could honor. One can try and work in ways that one would expect God to behave wants us to behave. And we can do things in our house too. I mean, the menorah candle, although the Hanukkah came after, I mean, the Maccabees were after the Torah. It was and not even in it. But with things that we have in our homes that relate to God, so you can glorify it through some artworks and beautiful things.
Okay, so Susan has clearly read this piece of Talmud over here because it's very, very similar. I said, Rebecca,
I haven't read that yet.
You haven't read it? Okay,
No.
so you preempted this exact piece of both elements of what you said are present in the Talmud. So Rebecca, I said you would go next, and then we're going to look at what Susan was talking about that she didn't even know she was talking about. That's in the Talmud. Yeah, Rebecca, go ahead.
Oh, this is my God, and I will enshrine him. For me, it's trying to maintain those 10 commandments and be merciful, be grateful, try to live my life as best as I can with fairness.
Nice. So using those values to guide you in your everyday life and behaviors. Nice. So let's just look at this piece of Talmud, and then we'll take the last comment about it. So in this piece of Talmud, what's happening is the rabbis are dissecting the word, what's translated in one place, here as enshrine, can also be translated as glorify. The Hebrew word is anvehu, and so they're playing with the word anvehu to see what that could mean. So Rabbi Ishmael, son of Rabbi Yochanan, only stated his opinion that one may do no more than the minimum requirement there with regard to the Pesach lamb. Oh, wait, sorry. Let me go down. Okay, here we go. This one I wanted to do. Okay, so they're trying to figure out, what does that word anvehu mean? How do we glorify God? So they are going with the part of the word of anvehu, like nava, naveh, like to beautify, and interpreting the verse this way. They're saying it means to beautify yourself before God in mitzvot. So even if you can perform a mitzvah, even if you can perform a commandment in a very simple way, instead of performing it in the simplest way you can, to take that extra step to perform it with that extra nava, to give it more beauty in different kinds of ways. And so the Talmud gives the examples of making a beautiful sukkah, making a beautiful lulav, a beautiful shofar, a beautiful tzitzit, a beautiful Torah scroll with beautiful ink written by an expert scribe, and then wrapping that scroll in beautiful silk fabric. Susan, this is exactly what you were saying, how we show that glory, how we show that honor, both to the Torah, both to the text, but also in our own homes, in the way we approach different mitzvot, in the way we approach different Judaica, is as we pay that special attention to making things beautiful, it is a way of living out this verse from the Exodus from Egypt about glorifying God, which I think is such a beautiful framing for the way that we take this verse and can live it every single day in our lives and see it around us in our homes, in our temple. And then the other piece that I really like about what's written in the Talmud is another way of looking at this verse is to say anvehu, ani, I, vahu, and God. So to glorify, meaning me and God. For me to be like God. It says here, just as God is compassionate and merciful, so too should I be compassionate and merciful. That part of glorifying God is trying to emulate those godly qualities. So Rebecca, like you were saying, and Benjamin thinking of what are those moments that feel, or values that feel more connective, that make me either feel present or feel like I am living with truth and honesty and integrity, and to emulate that and those pieces that we see in God. So we'll pause there. I'm sorry we didn't make it more through Shirat Hayam, through the Song of the Sea. If there are any last thoughts, we'll take some last thoughts and then we'll wrap up. Yeah, Meryl, and then we'll wrap up.
I'm just thinking about what Susan said earlier, that by bringing those objects and those practices into our homes, we're connecting with ourselves, our families, not just our community. We're continuing it.
Nice. And we see ourselves as a chain in this link from the Israelites that were there at the sea to us too. There's a Lador Vador that the rabbis are bringing out here, and giving us a connection, and seeing the way that we can also pass down that connection. So my hope, my blessing for all of us this Shabbat and into the week ahead is to think about one of those two interpretations of Ze Eli V'Anvehu, this is my God, and I will glorify God. Either trying to pay special attention to really beautify some kind of mitzvah in your own life, or to take that other piece of Ani Vehu, I, along with God, what are the things that I am doing through my words and through my actions to be my best self, to feel this greater connection? So I want to thank everybody for our learning today. Wishing you all a Shabbat Shalom, and in the spirit of Be'anvehu, a Shabbat of beauty. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat
Thank
Shalom.
you.
Thank
Shabbat
you.
Shalom.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you,
Shabbat Shalom.
everyone.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Good to be with
Thank
you
you
all.
all.
Thank you.
Shabbat
Shalom.
Shalom to everybody.
Shabbat
Thank
Shalom.
You too.